Naomi Carter was a woman who had dedicated her life to the study and preservation of reptiles, a calling that set her apart in many ways. Born and raised in the urban sprawl of Chicago, she had discovered her love for snakes and other reptiles during a middle school field trip to the local zoo. While her classmates recoiled in fear or disgust, Naomi was captivated by the elegance of the creatures, how they moved, survived, and adapted. Over the years, that fascination became a passion, and the passion became her life's work. Her academic prowess and unyielding determination led her to obtain a doctorate in herpetology, a field where women, and particularly black women, were rare. She was known in the wildlife conservation community not only for her groundbreaking research, but also for her hands-on approach, often venturing into dangerous environments to rescue endangered species or mitigate ecological disasters. Her latest assignment brought her to the small, deeply insular town of Ridgeville, tucked away in the southern United States. Ridgeville was a place steeped in tradition, suspicion, and, for many outsiders, hostility. Naomi had been called to the area by an environmental organization that had received reports of illegal reptile breeding and trafficking on the outskirts of town. There was a particular concern about a site that locals referred to as the Pit, a decrepit and largely abandoned farmstead where rumors swirled of dangerous animals being kept in appalling conditions. Naomi's task was to assess the situation, remove any endangered species, and coordinate their relocation to a protected sanctuary. To her, it was just another mission, albeit one in a challenging locale. For Ridgeville, however, her arrival was a disruption, a bold intrusion into a community that did not take kindly to strangers, let alone a black woman with an air of authority and expertise. Naomi's first impression of Ridgeville was one of oppressive silence. As she drove into town in her battered but reliable Jeep, she noticed how heads turned, conversations halted, and eyes followed her every move. The town's main street, lined with weathered storefronts and the occasional Confederate flag, felt frozen in time. Despite her experience navigating difficult environments, Naomi felt a chill of unease creep over her. She was no stranger to prejudice. Her career had often placed her in the crosshairs of skeptical locals or outright hostility, but Ridgeville carried a tension that was palpable. It was as though the town itself resented her presence, an outsider with no intention of blending in or backing down. Her unease crystallized when she stopped at a local diner for a quick meal before heading to the motel where she'd be staying. The diner was a small, dimly lit establishment that smelled of fried food and old wood. As she walked in, conversations died, and the clinking of silverware on plates seemed to echo unnaturally. Naomi kept her posture straight, her expression neutral, and her movements deliberate as she found a seat at the counter. The waitress, a weary-looking woman in her 50s, approached hesitantly, her eyes darting toward the other patrons, as if seeking their approval before addressing Naomi. After taking her order, the waitress retreated quickly, leaving Naomi alone with the weight of the room's collective gaze. Among the onlookers was Officer Trent Davis, a local cop with a chip on his shoulder and a dark reputation. Trent sat at a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee and watching Naomi with the intensity of a predator sizing up potential prey. In his mid-40s, Trent was a man whose life had been shaped by bitterness and failure. Once an ambitious young recruit with dreams of rising through the ranks, his career had stalled in Ridgeville, where his abrasive personality and thinly veiled prejudices alienated even his peers. He harbored a deep resentment toward anyone he perceived as a threat to his fragile sense of authority, and Naomi, with her self-assured demeanor and clear purpose, represented everything he despised. When Naomi glanced in Trent's direction, their eyes briefly met. His stare was cold, unblinking, and full of a challenge she chose to ignore. She had encountered men like Trent before, small-town enforcers who thrived on intimidation and wielded their authority as a blunt instrument. Experience had taught her that the best response was often no response at all. She finished her meal quickly, paid her bill, and left the diner without looking back. The tension in the air lingered as she exited, but she had no intention of letting it distract her from her mission. Naomi's accommodations were as Spartan as she had expected: a small, run-down motel at the edge of town, its neon sign flickering intermittently. She spent the evening reviewing her notes and planning her approach for the next day. The report she'd received painted a grim picture: snakes kept in overcrowded cages, some injured or diseased, others bred for illegal sale on the black market. It was a scene she had encountered before, but it never became any easier. The mistreatment of these animals, combined with the human greed and ignorance that fueled it, was a constant source of anger and frustration for her. Still, she focused on the task at hand, knowing that her emotions could not cloud her judgment. The following morning, Naomi drove out to the site known as the Pit, accompanied by a local wildlife officer who had reluctantly agreed to assist her. The officer, a young man named Will Hargrove, seemed nervous and eager to keep his distance. He explained that the Pit had long been a source of trouble in the area, associated with shadowy dealings and whispered rumors of violence. Naomi listened carefully, noting the undercurrent of fear in his voice. It was clear that the site represented more than just an ecological issue. It was a wound in the fabric of the community, festering and ignored. As they approached the site, the landscape grew increasingly desolate. The farmstead was a sprawling collection of dilapidated buildings surrounded by overgrown vegetation and rusting equipment. The air was heavy with humidity and the faint, acrid smell of decay. Naomi could hear the faint hissing and rustling of snakes even before she exited the vehicle, a sound that would have unsettled most people, but was oddly reassuring to her. This was her domain, a place where her expertise could make a difference. What she did not anticipate, however, was the arrival of Trent Davis, his police cruiser kicking up a cloud of dust as he pulled up behind them. He emerged from the vehicle with a swagger, his hand resting on his belt and his expression a mixture of amusement and disdain. "He didn't think you'd last the night," he drawled, addressing Naomi as though they were old adversaries. "Guess you're more stubborn than I gave you credit for." Naomi met his gaze without flinching. "I'm here to do a job, Officer Davis. I suggest you let me get on with it." Trent chuckled, a low, menacing sound that carried no real humor. "Oh, I'll let you get on with it, all right. But don't think for a second that I'm not watching. This is my town, and we don't take kindly to outsiders poking their noses where they don't belong." Naomi felt her pulse quicken, but she refused to let him see any sign of intimidation. "I'm not here to make friends, officer. I'm here to help. Whether you like it or not is irrelevant." The tension between them crackled like a live wire, a prelude to the storm that was about to unfold. Naomi turned her attention back to the task at hand, determined to focus on the work that had brought her here. But as she began her inspection of the site, she couldn't shake the feeling that Trent's presence was more than a nuisance. It was a threat, one that would soon escalate in ways she could never have predicted. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the oppressive heat of Ridgeville began to bear down on Naomi as she worked methodically at the site known as the Pit. The overgrown vegetation around the dilapidated structures seemed almost alive, tendrils of vines creeping along the rusting equipment and broken-down fences. The sound of insects buzzed in the air, competing with the occasional rustle of movement from within the shadows of the old barn. Naomi, dressed in her durable field gear, had her sleeves rolled up as she carefully assessed the conditions of the makeshift reptile enclosures that had been haphazardly constructed with chicken wire, plywood, and even discarded car parts. Her observations confirmed the worst of the reports she had received. Dozens of snakes, some native, others clearly imported, were crammed into small cages, their bodies tangled together in ways that left them vulnerable to disease and injury. The more aggressive species were visibly agitated, their movements quick and restless, while others barely moved at all, their dull scales and sunken eyes signs of dehydration and malnourishment. Naomi crouched next to one of the cages, her gloved hands carefully reaching out to inspect a python with lesions across its body. Her lips pressed into a hard line as she took notes, her anger at the situation barely contained. Officer Will Hargrove stood several feet behind her, his arms crossed and his eyes darting nervously around the area. He had said little since their arrival, clearly uncomfortable with the sight and, perhaps, with Naomi's determination. She couldn't entirely blame him. It was obvious that this operation wasn't just a case of simple neglect. It was part of something larger, something more insidious. The number and variety of snakes, along with the makeshift holding pens and signs of recent activity, suggested a thriving trade. Naomi could almost feel the weight of the illicit enterprise that had been taking place here, a network of individuals profiting from the exploitation of these creatures. As she worked, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke through the ambient noise. Naomi straightened and turned just as Officer Trent Davis's police cruiser came into view, kicking up a cloud of dust as it barreled down the dirt path toward the pit. She felt a knot of frustration tighten in her stomach. Trent had already made his hostility toward her clear during their brief encounter at the diner, and now it seemed he had decided to escalate things. His cruiser screeched to a stop, and he climbed out with deliberate slowness, his boots crunching on the gravel as he adjusted his utility belt and surveyed the scene with an air of casual disdain. "Well, look at you, Doc," Trent called out, his voice dripping with mockery as he sauntered toward her. "Working hard or hardly working?" Naomi ignored the jab and returned her focus to the python she had been examining. "What do you want, Officer Davis?" she asked evenly, not bothering to look up. "What do I want?" Trent repeated, feigning surprise. "Well, I guess I just wanted to make sure you're not causing any trouble. You know, stirring up things that don't need to be stirred." Naomi finally stood, turning to face him. "If by stirring up you mean trying to save these animals from the hell they've been subjected to, then yes, I'm stirring, and I don't have time for interruptions." Trent smirked, his gaze moving from her face to the cages behind her. "You know, Doc, this little operation of yours might rub some folks the wrong way. People around here don't take kindly to outsiders snooping around their property, asking too many questions. Might even get yourself into some trouble." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about your so-called locals. This is about illegal animal trafficking, and I'm here to put a stop to it. Now, unless you're here to help, I suggest you get out of my way." The tension between them hung thick in the air, but before Naomi could turn back to her work, Trent took a deliberate step closer. His smirk had faded, replaced by a hard edge in his eyes. "Let me tell you how this is going to go," he said, his tone low and menacing. "You're going to pack up your little science project and get the hell out of Ridgeville. You're not wanted here. And trust me, you don't want to find out what happens to people who stick their noses where they don't belong." Naomi stared at him, her pulse quickening. She had dealt with her share of intimidation tactics over the years, but there was something about Trent's demeanor that set her on edge. He wasn't bluffing. She could see it in the way his hand lingered near his holster, in the way his jaw tightened as he waited for her reaction. "Are you threatening me, Officer Davis?" she asked, her voice steady despite the spike of adrenaline coursing through her. Trent chuckled darkly. "Oh, I don't need to threaten you, Doc. I'm just giving you some friendly advice." Before Naomi could respond, Trent's attention shifted to one of the larger enclosures nearby, where a collection of venomous snakes writhed under the harsh light. He moved toward it, his curiosity piqued, and Naomi felt a surge of alarm. "I wouldn't touch that if I were you," she called out sharply, moving to intercept him. Trent ignored her, crouching next to the enclosure and peering inside. "What's in here?" "Some of your pets," he sneered. Naomi stopped a few feet away, her tone firm. "Those are highly venomous. The conditions therein have made them agitated. If you don't know what you're doing, you could get yourself killed." Trent shot her a condescending look. "Relax, Doc. I've dealt with worse than a couple of snakes." With that, he reached for the latch on the enclosure, his fingers fumbling with the rusted metal. Naomi's breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward, her voice rising. "Stop. You don't know what you're." The latch gave way, and the door swung open with a creak. In an instant, one of the larger snakes, a coiled-up viper, lunged forward, its body striking out with deadly precision. Trent jerked back, his face paling as the snake's fangs sank into the edge of his boot. He stumbled, cursing loudly, and kicked his leg wildly, sending the snake slithering back into the enclosure. Naomi stepped in, her movements swift and controlled, and secured the latch before the situation could spiral further. She turned to Trent, who was still cursing under his breath, his hand gripping his leg despite the fact that the snake hadn't broken through the leather of his boot. "You're lucky it didn't get you," she said coldly. "That kind of bite could kill a man in minutes." Trent glared at her, his face red with a mixture of embarrassment and fury. "This is your fault," he spat. "If you hadn't brought this mess here." "This mess was already here," Naomi shot back, her patience wearing thin. "And it's people like you who let it happen. Now, unless you want to end up in the hospital, or worse, I suggest you let me do my job." The confrontation left Trent seething, but Naomi didn't wait for his response. She turned back to her work, her hands steady even as her mind raced. She knew that this was far from over. Trent wasn't the type to back down, and his bruised ego would only make him more dangerous. The knot in her stomach tightened as she considered what might come next, but she pushed the thought aside. There was too much at stake for her to let fear take hold. Naomi's instincts told her that Officer Trent Davis was far from done with his attempts to assert dominance over her. The confrontation at the pit earlier that day had left a bitter taste in her mouth, and as she continued her work into the late afternoon, she found herself glancing over her shoulder more than she cared to admit. The air around the site seemed heavier now, laden with a foreboding sense that something wasn't right. The pit itself, an expansive area filled with a mishmash of cages, discarded tools, and ominous signs of neglect, felt like the epicenter of a growing storm. Naomi worked steadily, documenting the condition of the snakes and taking detailed notes on their environments. The animals' suffering was evident in every glance over crowded enclosures, open wounds, and the lethargy of creatures that had been denied proper care for far too long. She moved carefully and deliberately, not just for her safety but also to avoid causing the snakes further distress. Her gloved hands worked quickly to administer basic care where she could, knowing full well that many of these animals wouldn't survive another week in these conditions if help didn't come soon. By late afternoon, Naomi had managed to safely relocate a few of the smaller, less aggressive snakes to temporary transport containers she had brought with her. These would be sent to nearby sanctuaries for rehabilitation. The process was slow and tedious, but she was making progress. Will Hargrove, The local wildlife officer who had reluctantly accompanied her stayed at a distance, his unease growing with every passing hour. He was a young man, perhaps in his early 30s, with an earnestness that betrayed his inexperience. Naomi could tell he wanted to help, but fear held him back, fear of the snakes, certainly, but also of the potential fallout from her presence in Ridgeville. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the pit, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the relative silence. Naomi stiffened, her pulse quickening as she recognized the rumble of a police cruiser. She turned just in time to see Trent's car pull up once again, his heavy frame stepping out with an air of smug authority. This time he wasn't alone. Another officer, a younger man with a less aggressive demeanor, followed him out. Naomi immediately sensed that the second officer wasn't here willingly. His posture was tense, and his eyes flicked between Trent and Naomi, as though he was trying to gauge the situation before committing to any action. "Back so soon?" Naomi asked dryly, her voice carrying over the distance between them. She set down the equipment she had been holding and straightened to face them, her expression carefully neutral. Trent's lips curled into a smirk as he adjusted his utility belt. "Well, Doc, I figured I'd come back and see how you're doing. Can't leave you all alone out here with these lovely creatures." His tone was dripping with mockery, but there was a sharper edge to it this time, a deliberate attempt to provoke her. "I'm doing just fine, thanks," Naomi replied evenly. "Unless you're here to offer actual help, I suggest you let me finish my work." Trent's smirk widened, and he took a step closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Oh, I'm here to help, all right. I'm here to make sure everything is on the up and up. Wouldn't want anyone accusing me of neglecting my duties." Naomi's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "If you're so concerned about your duties, maybe you should focus on shutting down whoever's responsible for this operation instead of harassing the people trying to clean it up." Trent's expression darkened, the smirk fading as his eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone, Doc," he said coldly. "You might think you're untouchable with all your degrees and fancy credentials, but out here you're just another outsider who doesn't know how things work." The threat was thinly veiled, and Naomi felt a spike of anger rise in her chest. But before she could respond, the younger officer, whose name tag read Murphy, stepped forward hesitantly. Trent, maybe we should just let her finish. She seems to have things under control." Trent shot him a glare that could have frozen water. "Stay out of this, Murphy," he snapped. "I'm running this show." Murphy immediately stepped back, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of submission. Naomi felt a pang of sympathy for him. It was clear he didn't want to be here, but he also didn't have the backbone to stand up to Trent. The situation escalated further when Trent turned his attention to one of the larger cages near the center of the pit. Inside, a massive Burmese python lay coiled, its sheer size and girth enough to make even seasoned handlers cautious. Naomi had been planning to save this particular snake for last, knowing it would require the most care and expertise to safely relocate. "What do we have here?" Trent said, his voice taking on a mocking lilt as he approached the cage. He crouched down, peering through the rusted bars. "Big guy, huh? You think he's dangerous?" "Step away from that cage," Naomi said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "That snake is already stressed, and if you aggravate it further, you're putting yourself and everyone else in danger." Trent turned to look at her, his smirk returning. "Dangerous, huh? You mean to tell me this thing could actually hurt someone? Guess we'll just have to see about that." Before Naomi could stop him, Trent reached for the cage's latch. Her heart leapt into her throat as she moved toward him, her voice rising. "Trent, don't." But it was too late. The latch gave way with a metallic creak, and the door swung open. The python, sensing the disturbance, uncoiled slightly, its massive body shifting with a low, almost imperceptible hiss. Trent hesitated for a split second, as though realizing he had underestimated the situation, but his bravado quickly took over. He reached inside the cage, his movements confident but reckless. The snake reacted immediately. Its head shot forward, its mouth open wide as it struck with a speed and precision that left no room for error. Trent barely managed to pull his hand back in time, stumbling backward and falling onto the gravel. The python stopped short of fully leaving the cage, but the message was clear: it wouldn't tolerate further intrusion. Naomi wasted no time. She stepped in quickly, using her training to calm the snake with slow, deliberate movements. She spoke softly, her voice steady and soothing, as she guided it back into the cage and secured the latch. Her hands moved with the practiced ease of someone who had faced situations like this before, though her pulse was racing. When she turned back to Trent, he was still on the ground, his face pale and his chest heaving. The younger officer, Murphy, stood frozen nearby, his expression one of wide-eyed shock. "Are you out of your mind?" Naomi demanded, her voice sharp with anger. "You could have gotten yourself killed, or worse, gotten that snake killed. Do you have any idea how reckless that was?" Trent scrambled to his feet, brushing off the gravel from his uniform. His face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and fury. "Don't you lecture me, Doc," he growled, pointing a finger at her. "You're the one bringing this crap into my town. If anyone's a danger here, it's you." Naomi took a step closer, her glare unrelenting. "I'm here to fix a problem your town ignored for years. If you want to play the tough guy, be my guest, but stay the hell out of my way. Next time, you might not be so lucky." Trent's jaw clenched, and for a moment she thought he might lash out again. But instead he turned on his heel and stormed back to his cruiser, barking at Murphy to follow. The younger officer hesitated, giving Naomi an apologetic look before hurrying after his superior. As the sound of the cruiser's engine faded into the distance, Naomi let out a long breath, her hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She glanced back at the python, which had settled down once more, its massive body coiled tightly in the corner of the cage. She couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just the beginning, a prelude to something far more dangerous. Trent's bruised ego and wounded pride would only make him more determined to prove his dominance, and Naomi knew she needed to be ready for whatever came next. But for now, there was still work to be done. She adjusted her gloves and turned back to the task at hand, her resolve stronger than ever. As the day wore on and the sun began to sink lower, casting a golden glow over the pit, Naomi continued her work with a renewed sense of urgency. The confrontation with Trent had left her unsettled but resolute. His reckless actions and blatant disregard for the safety of both the snakes and the people around them only underscored the need to shut down this operation for good. The animals she had managed to move into temporary transport containers were only the beginning. There were still several larger, more aggressive snakes that required careful handling, and the conditions of the pit itself, unstable cages, debris, and the ever-present sense of decay made every moment perilous. Will Hargrove had finally mustered enough courage to help with the smaller tasks. Though he was still visibly uneasy around the snakes, his willingness to assist provided Naomi with at least some measure of relief. She didn't have time to babysit him, but his presence was better than nothing. They worked in silence for the most part, the only sounds being the occasional hiss of a snake or the rustle of dried grass underfoot. Naomi had just finished securing another transport container when she noticed movement in the distance. Her muscles tensed instinctively as her eyes locked onto the approaching figure. It was Trent again, but this time he wasn't alone. Two other men flanked him, locals by the look of their rugged, sunburned faces and worn clothing. One carried a crowbar slung casually over his shoulder, while the other gripped a length of thick rope in his calloused hands. The sight sent a shiver down Naomi's spine, but she forced herself to remain composed. Trent strode toward her with the same swagger he always seemed to carry, his smirk firmly in place as though he'd already won some unspoken battle. "Doc," he called out, his voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. "You're still here. Guess you didn't take my advice earlier." Naomi straightened, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I'm here to do my job, Officer Davis," she replied coolly. "I don't scare off that easily." "Well, that's a shame," Trent said, his smirk widening. "Because you really should have left while you had the chance." The two men beside him chuckled, their laughter low and unpleasant. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to show any sign of fear. She glanced at Will, who stood frozen a few feet away, his face pale. She could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to intervene but didn't know how. Trent gestured toward the pit with a lazy wave of his hand. "You've been busy, I see. Cleaning up this mess like it's gonna make a difference. Let me tell you something, Doc. This place has been like this for years, and it's not going to change just because some outsider shows up with her fancy degrees and her big ideas." Naomi folded her arms across her chest, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "It's going to change because it has to. What's happening here is illegal, unethical, and dangerous. And if you think you can scare me off, you're wasting your time." Trent's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of something darker: frustration, maybe even anger. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he said, his voice low and venomous. "Coming in here, telling us how to run our town. You don't belong here, Doc. And I'm about to show you why." Before Naomi could respond, Trent barked an order to the two men. "Grab her." The words barely registered before the two locals moved toward her, their intentions clear. Naomi's body reacted before her mind could catch up, adrenaline surging as she stepped back, her hands coming up in a defensive gesture. "Don't touch me," she said sharply, her voice carrying a warning. But the men didn't stop. One lunged toward her, and she pivoted out of his reach, her movements quick and precise. The other swung the rope in an attempt to snare her arm, but she ducked, narrowly avoiding it. Her training and instincts kicked in, and for a moment she thought she might be able to outmaneuver them. But the uneven terrain of the pit worked against her. Her foot caught on a loose piece of metal, and she stumbled, giving the men the opening they needed. Strong hands grabbed her arms, yanking her upright. Naomi struggled, but their grip was relentless. She felt the rough texture of the rope as they looped it around her wrists, binding her hands together. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but the odds were stacked against her. Trent watched the scene unfold with a look of satisfaction, his smirk returning as he stepped closer. "You're pretty feisty for a scientist," he said mockingly. "But let's see how tough you really are." Naomi glared at him, her chest heaving as she fought to control her breathing. "What are you doing, Trent?" she demanded. "This isn't just harassment anymore. You're crossing a line you can't come back from." Trent leaned in, his face inches from hers. "You don't get it, do you? This is my town, my rules. You come here stirring up trouble, making me look bad. You think I'm just gonna let that slide?" Before Naomi could respond, Trent nodded to the men holding her. "Take her to the pit." Her blood ran cold at the words. "Don't you dare," she began, but her protests were cut off as the men dragged her toward the edge of the largest enclosure. Her feet scrambled against the gravel, but it was no use. The pit loomed ahead, a deep, gaping hole lined with rusted fencing and teeming with snakes and sizes. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest as they reached the edge. She could hear the hissing and rustling of the snakes below, their movements a chaotic tangle of scales and fangs. She struggled harder, panic threatening to overtake her, but the men's grip was unyielding. Trent stood over her, his shadow stretching long in the fading light. "You wanted to play with snakes, Doc," he said, his voice full of cruel amusement. "Well, here's your chance." With that, he gave a signal, and the men shoved her forward. Naomi's body lurched as she lost her balance, the world tilting around her. She hit the ground hard, the impact jarring every bone in her body. The air was thick with the acrid smell of decay, and the sound of the snakes was deafening. She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, her bound wrists making the movement awkward and painful. The snakes were everywhere, their bodies coiling and uncoiling, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. Naomi's mind raced, her training battling with the primal fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She knew she couldn't panic, not here, not now. Panic would only make things worse. Above her, Trent and the two men looked down into the pit, their faces obscured by the shadows. She could hear their laughter, low and mocking, as though they had already won. But Naomi wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She forced herself to take slow, steady breaths, her mind focusing on what she knew. Snakes responded to movement, to vibrations. If she could stay calm, stay still, she might have a chance to turn the situation to her advantage. She shifted her weight carefully, her eyes scanning the pit for anything she could use. Her wrists were still bound, but she could feel the knot of the rope pressing against her skin. If she could just get to her knife still strapped to her belt, she might be able to cut herself free. One of the snakes, a large viper with shimmering scales, slithered closer, its tongue flicking out as it tasted the air. Naomi remained still, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the weight of the men's gaze above her, their laughter grating in her ears. But she blocked it out, focusing only on the task at hand. She didn't know how long she had before the situation escalated further, but one thing was certain, she wasn't going to let Trent win. Naomi lay motionless in the pit for a long, agonizing moment, her body tense and her mind racing. The snakes around her moved in unpredictable waves, their scaled bodies weaving in and out of the tangled debris that littered the bottom of the enclosure. The knot of the rope binding her wrists bit into her skin as she strained against it, her fingers itching to reach the knife holstered at her belt. Above her, Trent and his cronies were laughing, their voices a cruel soundtrack to the chaos around her. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to panic, to fight or flee, but she forced herself to stay still. If there was one thing she knew for certain, it was that fear only made things worse in a situation like this. "What's the matter, Doc?" Trent called from above, his voice full of mockery. "Thought you loved snakes. Now's your chance to get up close and personal." Naomi ignored him, her focus narrowing to the task at hand. She couldn't afford to waste energy on anger, or fear not when her survival depended on precision. The snakes weren't attacking, which was a small mercy, but she knew that any sudden movement could change that. Slowly, carefully, she shifted her weight, inching her bound hands closer to her belt. The knife felt tantalizingly close, but the angle was awkward, and the coarse rope rubbed painfully against her skin with every movement. Above her, Trent's amusement began to shift into irritation. "She's not even screaming," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. "What's wrong with her? Shouldn't she be begging for help by now?" One of the men beside him, the one holding the crowbar, shrugged. "Maybe she's too scared to move. Either way, it's kind of boring. Thought this was going to be more fun." Trent's expression darkened, and Naomi could feel the shift in his demeanor even without looking at him. His bruised ego and need for control were pushing him towards something reckless. She could sense it in the way his voice grew sharper, more impatient. "Get me the hook," Trent snapped, gesturing toward a long metal rod leaning against the edge of the pit. It was the kind of tool used to handle large snakes, though Trent clearly had no idea how to use it properly. His intentions, however, were clear. He wanted to provoke a reaction, to force Naomi into a position where she would either have to defend herself or succumb to panic. The man with the rope hesitated. "You sure that's a good idea? Those things don't look too friendly." Trent shot him a withering glare. "Just do it." Reluctantly, the man grabbed the hook and handed it to Trent, who descended a few steps down the rickety ladder leading into the pit. Naomi heard the creak of the wood and the faint scrape of the metal hook against the ladder's side. Her heart rate quickened, but she kept her breathing steady, her hands still working against the rope binding her wrists. The knife was just within reach now, her fingers brushing against the handle. Trent stopped halfway down the ladder, the hook extended in front of him like a weapon. He grinned down at her, the cruel amusement back in his eyes. "Let's see how much you really know about these things, Doc." He jabbed the hook toward one of the larger snakes, a massive boa constrictor that had been coiled in a far corner of the pit. The snake reared its head slightly, its tongue flicking out as it assessed the disturbance. Naomi clenched her jaw, her movements slowing as she watched the scene unfold. The boa wasn't venomous, but it was strong enough to crush a man if it felt threatened. Trent, of course, had no idea what he was dealing with. "Leave it alone," Naomi said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension. "You're going to get yourself hurt." Trent ignored her, his attention focused entirely on the snake. He swung the hook clumsily, prodding at the boa's coiled body. The snake hissed, its muscles tensing as it prepared to defend itself. Naomi's breath caught in her throat as she saw the danger escalating, but her hands finally closed around the handle of her knife. With a quick, practiced motion, she angled the blade against the rope and began sawing through the fibers. "Trent, stop!" she shouted, her voice commanding. "You don't know what you're doing." But Trent was too far gone, his need to assert control overriding any sense of self-preservation. He jabbed the hook again, this time hitting the snake more forcefully. The boa uncoiled in an instant, its body lashing out with a speed that caught even Naomi off guard. Trent yelped, stumbling back as the snake's thick body struck the ladder, sending him teetering precariously. Naomi seized the moment. The rope around her wrists finally gave way, and she yanked her hands free, the knife clattering to the ground beside her. She scrambled to her feet, her movements careful but swift as she positioned herself between Trent and the snakes. The bow, still agitated, loomed nearby, its body undulating with barely contained tension. Trent clung to the ladder, his face pale as he realized just how close he had come to falling. "You crazy bitch," he spat, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "What the hell are you doing?" "Saving your life," Naomi shot back, her eyes blazing. She crouched low, her hands outstretched in a calming gesture as she addressed the bow. Her voice softened, taking on a soothing cadence as she murmured to the snake, her words a steady rhythm designed to de-escalate the situation. The bow's movement slowed, its posture relaxing slightly as it retreated back to its corner. Naomi straightened, her gaze snapping back to Trent. "Get out of the pit," she said coldly. "Now." Trent hesitated, his pride warring with his self-preservation. But the intensity in Naomi's eyes left no room for argument. He began to climb back up the ladder, his movements clumsy and awkward. The two men waiting above helped him over the edge, their expressions a mixture of confusion and unease. Naomi didn't waste any time. She grabbed her knife and tucked it back into its holster, her focus shifting to the other snakes in the pit. She knew she couldn't stay here much longer. Trent's temper was as dangerous as the reptiles around her, and she needed to get out before he decided to escalate things even further. When she finally climbed out of the pit, her body aching and her clothes smeared with dirt, she was met with the hostile stares of Trent and his lackeys. Trent's face was twisted with rage, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. For a moment, Naomi thought he might actually draw it, but then he seemed to think better of it. Instead, he stepped forward, his voice low and seething. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he said. "Think you can just waltz in here and make me look like a fool?" Naomi squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze head-on. "You don't need my help to look like a fool, Trent. You're doing just fine on your own." The tension between them crackled like a live wire, but Naomi refused to back down. She could feel the weight of the other men's stares, their uncertainty hanging in the air. Trent was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice trembling with barely restrained fury. "You're going to regret ever stepping foot in this town." Naomi didn't flinch. "Maybe," she said calmly, "but not today." With that, she turned her back on him and walked away, her steps deliberate and steady. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to move faster, to put as much distance between herself and Trent as possible, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. She couldn't afford to show weakness, not now, not ever. As she reached the safety of her jeep, Naomi allowed herself a moment to breathe. Her hands were still trembling, her pulse racing, but she had survived. And now, more than ever, she was determined to finish what she had started. Trent might have tried to break her, but all he had done was strengthen her resolve. This fight wasn't over. But Naomi knew one thing for certain: she wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The night descended upon Ridgeville, cloaking the pit and its surrounding wasteland in a heavy darkness broken only by the dim glow of Naomi's flashlight as she worked tirelessly. The events of the day had left her body aching and her mind racing, but there was no time to dwell on the pain. She had made it through the pit alive, humiliated Trent in the process, and gained a renewed clarity about the fight she was facing. This wasn't just about saving snakes or shutting down an illegal operation. It was about standing up against the rot that festered in places like Ridgeville, embodied by men like Trent. Yet she knew he wouldn't take his defeat lightly, and she could feel his shadow looming over her even now. Naomi was carefully packing the last of the smaller snakes into their transport containers when she heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Her pulse quickened as headlights illuminated the pit, casting long, eerie shadows against the rusted enclosures. She set the container down and stood, turning toward the approaching vehicle. It was Trent's cruiser, but this time he was alone. The sound of the engine died, and the oppressive silence of the night pressed in. The door slammed, and Trent emerged, his silhouette framed by the dim glow of his headlights. He walked toward her with deliberate slowness, the tension in his body radiating outward like a palpable force. Naomi held her ground, her flashlight steady in her hand as she met his gaze. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Trent growled, his voice low and dangerous. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for Naomi to see the barely contained fury in his eyes. "I could say the same about you," Naomi replied, her tone measured but firm. She refused to let him see the fear that was beginning to coil in her gut. "Why are you here, Trent? Haven't you embarrassed yourself enough for one day?" His lips twisted into a cruel smirk, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You've been a thorn in my side since the moment you got here, Doc. And I'm tired of it. You think you can come into my town, make a fool out of me, and just walk away? Not a chance. Naomi's grip on the flashlight tightened, her knuckles whitening. I'm not here to make enemies, but if you keep pushing me, you'll get more than you bargained for. I'm not afraid of you, Trent. You should be, he said darkly. With a quick, fluid motion, he drew his service weapon, the barrel glinting in the dim light as he aimed it directly at her. Now, you're going to pack up your little operation and get the hell out of my town. Tonight. Naomi's heart hammered in her chest, but her expression remained steely. If you think I'm going to abandon these animals or let you bully me into silence, you're even more pathetic than I thought. Trent took a step closer, the gun unwavering in his hand. I'm done playing games, Carter. You think the law's on your side? Newsflash, the law's whatever I say it is out here. And you're just another outsider nobody's gonna miss. The weight of his words pressed down on her, but Naomi's mind was already racing, calculating. Her eyes flicked to the surrounding enclosures, the movement of the snakes barely perceptible in the darkness. She needed to buy time, to find a way to turn the situation to her advantage. I've dealt with men like you before, she said, her voice steady despite the danger. Cowards who hide behind their authority because they have nothing else. You can wave that gun around all you want, Trent, but it doesn't change what you are. Trent's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening around the grip of his weapon. Shut up, he barked, his voice cracking with frustration. You think you're better than me? Smarter? You don't know a damn thing about this town, about me? Then why don't you show me? Naomi challenged, her gaze unwavering. Show me who you really are. Her words struck a nerve, and for a moment, Trent's composure faltered. His hand trembled slightly, the barrel of the gun dipping before he forced it back up. Naomi seized the moment, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a low, commanding tone. Put the gun down, Trent, she said, before you do something you can't take back. But Trent wasn't ready to back down. His desperation had driven him to the edge, and Naomi could see that he was teetering, the balance of power shifting between them. She knew she needed to act before he made his move. With a sudden burst of movement, Naomi swung her flashlight, the heavy metal casing connecting with Trent's wrist. He cried out, the gun flying from his hand and clattering to the ground. Naomi didn't hesitate. She lunged for the weapon, kicking it away before he could recover. Trent staggered, clutching his wrist, his expression a mixture of shock and rage. You're gonna regret that? He snarled, his voice dripping with venom. Naomi stood her ground, her breath coming in sharp, controlled bursts. You don't scare me, Trent. Not anymore. The sound of hissing cut through the air, drawing both of their attention. One of the larger snakes, a king cobra, had escaped its damaged enclosure and now coiled menacingly nearby, its hood flared and its movements deliberate. Naomi's eyes darted between the snake and Trent, her mind racing as she calculated her next move. Trent's face twisted with fear as he stumbled back, his bravado crumbling in the face of the real danger. Get that thing away from me, he shouted, his voice rising in panic. Naomi took a slow, deliberate step forward, her gaze locked on the cobra. You wanted to play with snakes, Trent, she said coldly. Let's see how brave you really are. The cobra shifted, its body undulating as it focused on Trent's erratic movements. Naomi, meanwhile, remained calm, her body language calculated to avoid provoking the snake further. She had dealt with cobras before and knew that fear and aggression only made them more dangerous. Trent, however, was beyond reason. He tripped over a loose piece of debris, falling hard onto the ground as the cobra slithered closer. His breathing was ragged, his eyes wide with terror as he scrambled backward, his hands clawing at the dirt. Naomi moved between Trent and the snake, her voice steady as she addressed the cobra. "Easy now," she murmured, her tone low and soothing. "No one's going to hurt you." The cobra paused, its body coiled tightly as it assessed her. Naomi reached for a nearby containment hook, her movements slow and deliberate. She carefully maneuvered the snake, guiding it back toward a safe distance before securing it in a temporary enclosure. Only when the lid was firmly in place did she turn her attention back to Trent. He was still on the ground, his chest heaving as he stared at her in disbelief. The once dominant officer now looked small and broken, stripped of his power and authority. "This is over, Trent," Naomi said, her voice firm but calm. "You don't get to threaten me or anyone else ever again. You're done." Trent didn't respond, his head hanging low as the weight of his defeat settled over him. Naomi stepped back, her gaze steady as she turned toward her jeep. She had won, but the battle had left its mark. As she loaded the remaining snakes into the vehicle, the enormity of what she had faced began to sink in. Yet she knew that this was just the beginning. Trent might have been silenced, but the fight to bring justice to Ridgeville and to protect the creatures she had dedicated her life to was far from over. The early light of dawn spilled across the pit, painting the chaos of the night before in muted tones of grey and gold. The once threatening landscape, with its rusted cages and tangled debris, now looked tired and defeated, much like the man who sat slumped on the ground near the edge of the enclosure. Trent Davis, his uniform soiled and his confidence shattered, stared blankly at the dirt beneath his boots. His gun was nowhere in sight, his authority stripped as thoroughly as his composure had been the night before. Naomi Carter watched him from a distance, her body still humming with the adrenaline of survival, but her mind sharp and focused. There was no satisfaction in seeing him like this, only a grim sense of finality. The snakes had been secured, each one carefully packed into transport containers that now filled the back of Naomi's jeep. The larger specimens had required all of her strength and expertise to handle, their agitation from the events of the night adding to the difficulty. Yet despite the exhaustion weighing on her shoulders, she felt an unshakable resolve. The animals were safe now, their suffering at the hands of Ridgeville's neglect finally at an end. She had won, though the cost of that victory was something she wasn't yet ready to dwell on. Will Hargrove arrived shortly after sunrise, his face pale and drawn as he parked his truck near the edge of the site. The young wildlife officer had spent the night in a state of conflict, torn between his duty and his fear of standing up to Trent. When he saw Naomi standing tall and composed amidst the wreckage, and Trent reduced to a shadow of himself, his eyes widened in disbelief. What happened here?" Will stammered, his gaze darting between Naomi and Trent. Naomi turned to him, her expression calm but steely. "Justice," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of everything unsaid. She gestured toward the containers in her jeep. "The animals are ready for transport. We need to get them to the sanctuary before they're exposed to any more stress." Will nodded quickly, eager to focus on the task at hand. He approached Trent cautiously, as though the man might lash out at any moment, but Trent didn't move. He didn't speak either. Whatever fight he'd had in him was gone. "Do you want me to do something about him?" Will asked hesitantly, his voice low. Naomi shook her head. "He's not my problem anymore," she said. "But someone needs to make sure he answers for what he's done, not just to me, but to this town and to these animals." Will nodded again, though his uncertainty was clear. Naomi had no illusions about Ridgeville's capacity for justice. Men like Trent thrived in places like this, because the system allowed them to. Still, she had planted a seed, and she hoped that Will, despite his inexperience and fear, might be the one to see it grow. With the snakes secured and the site documented for the environmental authorities, Naomi climbed into her jeep, her hands gripping the wheel tightly as she prepared to leave the pit behind. The drive to the sanctuary was long and uneventful, the hours stretching out as the rural landscape rolled by in shades of green and brown. She kept the radio off, the silence giving her time to process everything that had happened. Her thoughts returned to the moment she had faced the cobra in the pit, Trent's voice echoing in her ears as he mocked her, belittled her, and tried to break her. He had failed, but the scars of his cruelty would linger. She thought of the people in Ridgeville who had stood by and allowed men like him to thrive, their complicity as damning as his actions. The fight wasn't over, not for her, not for the animals, and not for the countless others who faced injustice in towns like this every day. When she finally arrived at the sanctuary, she was greeted by a team of volunteers and professionals who immediately began unloading the snakes with careful precision. The facility was a stark contrast to the pit, its enclosures clean and spacious, designed to mimic the natural habitats of its inhabitants. Naomi watched as the snakes were carried away, their suffering finally at an end. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was tempered by the knowledge that there were countless others still in need of help. The sanctuary's director, a kind-eyed woman named Elena, approached Naomi as the last container was carried inside. "You've done something incredible here," Elena said, her voice warm with gratitude. "These animals owe you their lives." Naomi shook her head. "They don't owe me anything," she said. "I was just doing what needed to be done." Elena placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder, her expression sincere. "Sometimes doing what needs to be done is the hardest thing of all. But you did it, and that matters." Naomi nodded, though she still felt the weight of the past few days pressing down on her. She stayed at the sanctuary for several hours, helping to settle the snakes into their new enclosures and ensuring that each one received the care it needed. By the time she left, the sun was beginning to set, casting the world in shades of amber and crimson. The drive back to Ridgeville was quieter than the first, the town looming on the horizon like a shadow she couldn't quite escape. When she arrived, she went straight to her motel, her body aching with exhaustion. She collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling as the events of the past days replayed in her mind. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deep and dreamless. The next morning, Naomi packed her belongings into her jeep, her work in Ridgeville officially done. As she drove out of town, she passed the diner where she had first encountered Trent. The memory of his cold, mocking stare felt distant now, a ghost of a battle she had fought and won. She didn't stop, didn't look back. Ridgeville was behind her, but the fight for justice both for the animals she had saved and the countless others still in need was far from over. As the open road stretched out before her, Naomi felt a renewed sense of purpose. The scars of her ordeal would remain, but so would the lessons. Strength wasn't just about surviving, it was about fighting for something bigger than yourself, even when the odds were stacked against you. She tightened her grip on the wheel, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The road ahead was long, but she was ready for it.